They said she didn't belong on the parade ground. Said she was too small, too soft, too fragile to stand among the hardened ranks of the elite.
The colonel didn't just agree, he laughed in her face.
And in less than 3 minutes, she would have him on his back in the dirt, staring up at the sky, wondering what had just happened. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun beat down on the training yard of Fort Halverson, turning the packed dirt into a shimmering mirage. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, gun oil, and hot metal. Around the edges of the yard, soldiers leaned on the rails, their chatter a mix of anticipation and mockery. They weren't here for a fight, they were here for a spectacle. Word had spread quickly. A civilian-sized recruit had been foolish enough to challenge the colonel's authority during drills. Now she was going to learn her place. Her name was Kira Lorne. She stood barely 5'4", her frame wiry, her brown hair pulled back into a tight braid that brushed her shoulders. She wore the same fatigues as everyone else, but on her they looked almost too big. Her boots were caked in the same dust as the men beside her, yet she might as well have been invisible, until she spoke up that morning. The colonel, a towering man with a chest like an armored vehicle and a voice that could rattle glass, had been running the unit through hand-to-hand exercises when he singled her out for a demonstration. His grin had been wide and full of teeth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're about half the size of my shadow, Lorne," he'd said, chuckling as the others smirked. "But maybe you'll surprise me. Step forward." Kira didn't flinch. She'd been through enough in her life to recognize the sound of someone trying to humiliate her. She stepped into the center of the ring, the dust crunching under her boots. Around her, the voices of her fellow recruits grew louder, some betting on how fast she'd be on the ground. The colonel circled her like a predator testing its prey. His combat boots pounded the dirt with slow, deliberate steps. "Let's be clear," he said, "this isn't personal. You just happen to be the perfect example of what happens when someone who's not built for this tries to play soldier." His voice carried over the crowd, earning laughs and nods. "It's not your fault. Nature made you small. I just have to remind you where small ends up flat on the ground." Kira's eyes stayed locked on him. She didn't answer, didn't blink. Somewhere deep in her chest, her pulse was steady, almost calm. She'd heard words like his before. In alleys, in gyms, in training rooms where the walls sweated with steam. She knew how this script usually went, but she also knew she had the power to rewrite it. The colonel lunged without warning, a blur of movement for a man his size. His hands shot forward, aiming to grab her by the collar and toss her down in one swift, humiliating motion. Gasps rippled through the crowd as his arms clamped around her, and then somehow they didn't. Kira's left foot slid back, her hips pivoted, and in that instant, her body dropped low like a coiled spring. She felt his momentum slam into her shoulder, and instead of resisting it, she redirected it. The air seemed to slow around them. Her grip locked on his forearm, her legs drove up from the dirt, and she pulled, pivoted, and lifted in one seamless motion. The colonel's boots left the ground. It wasn't a stumble, it wasn't a trip. It was a clean, deliberate throw. His massive frame arced over her shoulder like a bag of grain, and he hit the dirt with a force that made the railings rattle. Dust exploded around them. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the yard erupted. Shouts, cheers, disbelief, dozens of voices overlapping in a wave of chaos. The colonel lay on his back, staring at the sky, his eyes wide in shock. Kira straightened, brushing the dust from her hands, her face calm, almost bored. She didn't gloat, she didn't speak. She just turned her head and looked at the recruits lining the rails, as if to say, "You saw that." The colonel's jaw tightened. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his face flushing deep red. Again he growled, his voice low but shaking with something between anger and awe. Kira only nodded once, and the watching crowd leaned forward, sensing they weren't just seeing a fluke, they were about to witness the start of something that would be talked about in Fort Halverson for years. The crowd hadn't stopped buzzing since the moment Kira put the colonel in the dirt. Soldiers who had been smirking minutes ago were now whispering to each other, leaning in close, like they were afraid to speak too loudly, in case they missed what came next. The colonel rose slowly to his feet, brushing the dust from his fatigues, the muscles in his neck and arms tightening with every breath. His expression wasn't just one of anger, it was something more complicated. She'd caught him off guard, and that in his mind was a crime. "You've got more than I expected," he said, circling her again. "But one throw doesn't win a fight." His eyes narrowed, the tone of his voice dropping into something dangerous. "This time I won't give you the chance." Kira adjusted her stance. She could feel the eyes on her, but her focus was locked entirely on him. She'd trained long enough to know that skill didn't matter if you let your opponent get inside your head. The first throw had been about timing and surprise. The second would be about control. She knew she wouldn't get another chance to shock him. Now he was watching, reading her movements. The colonel came in low this time, moving faster than someone his size had any right to. He led with a feint, shifting to the right before lunging left, his arm sweeping for her midsection. Kira sidestepped, letting his momentum slide past her again, but this time he caught her wrist. His grip was like steel. The crowd leaned forward, certain that this was where her luck ended, but Kira didn't fight against it. She shifted with his pull, spinning toward him, her free hand snapping up to push against the crook of his elbow. Pain flared in his face for just a moment before his free arm came up to counter. She ducked under it, twisting until she was behind him, but before she could set her feet, he spun with surprising speed and knocked her backward with a shoulder check. She hit the dirt hard, the jolt shooting up her spine. A cheer went up from the sidelines, the sound sharp and triumphant for those who wanted to see her fail. The colonel stepped toward her, his shadow stretching over her, as he loomed above. "That's more like it," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "On your feet." Kira rose slowly, dust sticking to the sweat on her cheek. She didn't rush, she didn't speak, she simply adjusted her footing, her eyes never leaving his. If he wanted to think she was slowing down, all the better. Her body ached from the hit, but her mind was sharper now, her breathing steady. She'd learned something important. He was faster than he looked, but he was still using force over finesse. He lunged again, but this time she met him halfway. Her arm shot up to block his grab, and she stepped inside his guard, her elbow driving into his ribs. It wasn't enough to drop him, but it made him grunt, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp hiss. The colonel's eyes widened a fraction, not in pain, but in recognition. She wasn't just reacting anymore, she was anticipating. They circled each other, the sound of their boots grinding the dirt, filling the silence between shouts from the sidelines. Every movement was measured now, both fighters reading and testing each other. Kira kept her shoulders loose, her stance ready to shift in any direction. She knew the next move could decide the tone for the rest of the match. The colonel charged again, leading with a high grab for her collar. Kira ducked low, her knee coming up into his thigh, and as he stumbled just enough to break his stance, she pivoted sharply, hooking his arm and stepping behind him. Her hip connected to his waist, and in one swift motion, she threw him forward over her leg. He hit the dirt again, the sound heavier this time. The crowd erupted, half in cheers, half in stunned silence. Kira backed away, giving him space to stand. She could have pressed the advantage, but that wasn't her goal. She wasn't here to humiliate him. She was here to prove she belonged. The colonel lay there for a moment, his palms pressed into the dirt as he caught his breath. When he finally pushed himself up, there was something different in his expression. The mocking smirk was gone, replaced by something closer to respect, though it was buried deep under his pride. "You're not done yet," he said, rolling his shoulders and stepping forward again. "Let's see if you can keep that up." Kira didn't answer, she didn't need to. Her silence spoke for her. The fight wasn't just physical anymore. It was about endurance, about who would break first. And she had no intention of being the one. The air in the training yard had shifted. The earlier laughter from the sidelines was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of tension that hummed through every watching soldier. Kira could feel it pressing in on her, a mix of curiosity, doubt, and something else, anticipation. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. Everyone knew that what happened here, could echo far beyond this dirt ring. For Kira, the stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just another sparring match, or a test of strength. This was her proving ground, the moment that would decide whether she stayed in Fort Halverson's elite program, or was quietly removed from it. She'd been warned when she first arrived, that the colonel was a gatekeeper, one who didn't waste his time on recruits he deemed unfit. If she failed here, she wouldn't get a second chance. The message would be sent too small, too weak, not worth the effort. She could live with losing a fight. What she couldn't live with was walking away, knowing she hadn't shown them who she really was. The colonel paced in front of her now, his boots grinding against the dirt, eyes sharp and assessing. "You've got fight, Lorne, I'll give you that," he said. "But fight alone won't keep you alive out there." His tone was no longer mocking, it carried the weight of a lesson. Still, his words were a test, pushing her to reveal cracks in her resolve. Kira's mind flashed back to the day she first stepped through the gates of Fort Halverson. The air had smelled of gunpowder and oil, the clang of metal ringing from the workshops. She'd walked past rows of soldiers, their uniforms immaculate, their faces carved with discipline. Many of them had looked at her with thinly veiled skepticism, and she'd felt the weight of every stare. She was used to it. Back home, she'd been underestimated her whole life, by classmates, coaches, even some of her own family. Her father had served in the forces, a decorated marksman, with a reputation for being unbreakable. He'd taught her the basics of self-defense before she was old enough to ride a bike, but he'd also been honest about the world she'd be walking into. "They'll see your size before they see your skill," he'd told her, "and they'll test you, every day. The trick is not just to survive the test, it's to own it." That voice echoed now in the back of her mind, as she faced the colonel. She knew this wasn't just a personal challenge. If she earned his respect, she'd silence the doubts of every soldier on this base. If she didn't, her days here were numbered. The colonel stopped pacing and raised his hand in a subtle signal to one of the senior instructors. A whistle blew, and two large soldiers stepped forward from the sidelines. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't part of the original sparring session. Kira glanced between them, reading their stances. They weren't here to hurt her, but they weren't going to make it easy either. "Let's make this interesting," the colonel said. "1 on 2. Let's see if you can adapt." Kira's pulse quickened. She knew the unspoken meaning behind this. If she could handle multiple opponents, even briefly, she'd prove she wasn't just a lucky throw against a single distracted target. But she also knew that the risk of failure had just doubled. The first soldier, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head, moved in quickly, trying to grab her arm. She sidestepped, only to be cut off by the second, a tall woman with quick hands. Kira dropped low, rolling to her left to avoid their reach. Her body moved on instinct, honed by years of drills and sparring matches in cramped spaces. She blocked, redirected, and twisted free, never staying in one place long enough for them to pin her. The crowd began to shout again, the noise bouncing off the walls of the yard. Kira could feel the burn in her lungs, the strain in her legs, but she kept moving. She knew if she slowed, they'd have her. She used the taller soldier's reach against her, pivoting and pulling to send her stumbling into the path of her partner. The moment's collision gave Kira just enough time to slip behind them, regaining her ground. The colonel watched, his expression unreadable. He wasn't looking for a knockout, or a flashy move. He was watching her choices, her reactions, her ability to stay composed under pressure. And that, more than anything, fueled Kira's determination. Every second she stayed on her feet was another piece of proof that she belonged here. Finally the whistle blew again. The two soldiers stepped back, nodding at her with the smallest hint of respect in their eyes. Kira straightened, brushing dust from her sleeve, her breathing steady, despite the adrenaline still surging through her. The colonel stepped forward, closing the distance between them, until they were only a foot apart. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze hard but no longer dismissive. "Not bad," he said. "You lasted longer than most would." Kira met his eyes, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not here to be most." The faintest curve touched the corner of his mouth before he turned away, signaling for a short break. But Kira knew the test wasn't over. not by a long shot. The real challenge was still ahead, and every instinct told her it would push her beyond anything she'd faced before. The colonel's order for a break gave Kira a few minutes to steady her breathing, but her mind didn't rest. As she stood in the shade at the edge of the training yard, she found herself thinking back, not to Fort Halverson, but to the small creaking gym on the east side of her hometown, where this fight had truly begun. She had been 12 the first time she set foot inside that place. The gym was nothing like the polished training halls she'd seen in movies. The walls were cracked concrete, the floor scarred from years of hard use, and the air smelled of chalk, leather, and sweat. It wasn't a place for show, it was a place for work. A place where people came to get stronger, or to prove they already were. Her father had brought her there after a particularly rough week at school. She'd been shoved into lockers, her backpack stolen, her size and quiet nature, the easiest targets for bullies. He hadn't yelled or lectured, he'd simply said, "You're going to learn how to make people think twice before they touch you." That day, she met her first instructor, a retired martial artist, named Mara Sato. Mara was barely taller than Kira was now, with wiry arms and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her voice was calm, but her movements were precise and dangerous. In their first lesson, she didn't teach Kira how to punch or kick, she taught her how to fall. "Everyone falls," Mara had said, guiding her through the motions, "but if you know how to fall, you can stand back up. And if you can stand back up, you haven't lost." For years Kira trained in that gym after school, running drills until her muscles ached and her lungs burned. She learned how to use leverage, how to turn an opponent's strength into a weakness, how to stay calm when the world seemed intent on crushing her. Mara drilled her relentlessly, never letting her hide behind excuses. "Speed and skill beat size when you make them work together," she would say. "But only if you keep your head clear." When her father passed away, unexpectedly when she was 17, Kira's world could have collapsed. Instead she buried herself in training. Mara became more than an instructor, she became the anchor that kept Kira from drifting. They spent hours sparring in the dusty light of the gym, sometimes in silence, sometimes with Mara offering quiet advice between strikes. Every lesson was a brick, building the foundation that now held Kira steady in Fort Halverson's yard. By the time she turned 20, Kira had earned a reputation in the local circuit for taking down opponents who outweighed her by 50 pounds or more. She never fought dirty, but she fought smart. She read her opponents, learned their rhythms, and dismantled their strategies piece by piece. She didn't win every match, but she walked away from each one stronger. Joining the military had been the next logical step, or so she'd thought. The reality was harsher. Here her skills didn't earn instant respect. Here she was starting from scratch again, surrounded by people who judged her before she even moved. And now with the colonel as her opponent, every hour she'd spent in that cramped gym was being put to the ultimate test. A voice snapped her back to the present. "Time's up," the colonel called, his tone clipped. The break was over. The soldiers around the yard were already returning to their places, eager to see what came next. Kira stepped forward again, the sun hot against her back, her boots grinding into the dirt. As she moved into the center of the yard, she caught sight of a few faces in the crowd, faces that no longer carried the same dismissive smirks as before. They had seen her last in the ring, and were starting to reassess. It wasn't full respect yet, but it was the first crack in the wall of doubt surrounding her. The colonel waited for her, arms crossed. "You've shown you can move," he said. "You've shown you can take a hit. Now I want to see if you can think under pressure." Kira tilted her head slightly, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She'd been thinking under pressure her entire life. The yard was quieter now, the earlier jeers replaced by a watchful stillness. Every soldier present seemed to know that the next exchange would be different. This wasn't about a quick throw, or a lucky counter anymore. The colonel was going to push Kira into territory where instinct alone wouldn't save her. He wanted to see how she thought when the ground shifted beneath her. He stepped forward, his presence commanding the space between them. "You've had your warm-up," he said, his voice low but carrying to the edges of the crowd. "Now we find out if you belong here." He didn't raise his tone, but the weight of his words tightened the air like a coiled spring. Kira matched his gaze, her stance steady. Her muscles still carried the faint tremor from the earlier bouts, but her breathing was under control. She had learned early on that fatigue could become an ally, if you didn't let it consume you. It slowed rash movements, forced precision. She suspected the colonel knew that too. Without another word, he gestured to the armory rack near the edge of the yard. An instructor stepped forward, carrying 2 padded training staffs. The crowd murmured. Hand to hand was one thing. Weapons added an entirely new layer to the fight. The staffs weren't lethal, but they could leave bruises and rattled bones if used with force. The colonel tossed one toward her. Kira caught it easily, feeling the balance in her hands. The weight was slightly heavier toward the ends, favoring wide sweeps and sharp blocks. She spun it once, getting a feel for the length, the grip, the resistance. It wasn't a weapon she'd trained with often, but the principles of control and timing didn't change. "You've got reach now," the colonel said. "Let's see if you know what to do with it." He came at her in a sudden burst, his own staff sweeping in a diagonal arc toward her ribs. The sound of the padded tip cutting through the air was sharper than she expected. She caught it with her own staff in a quick upward block, the impact reverberating through her arms. Before she could counter, he twisted the staff and drove the other end low toward her knee. Kira hopped back, letting the strike pass in front of her, then used the momentum to spin her staff, and aimed for his shoulder. He caught it easily, deflecting her blow and stepping inside her guard. The closeness cut down her advantage. She had no room for wide swings. Instead she dropped low, twisting her body to shove the staff between them, and force him back. The fight became a blur of strikes and counters, the thwack of padded ends, meeting in midair echoing in the yard. The crowd's voices rose and fell with each exchange. Kira moved with precision, never letting her staff linger in one place long enough for him to grab it. Still, the colonel's experience was obvious. He flowed from one move to the next, without hesitation, reading her footwork, adjusting his stance to keep her on the defensive. Then he feinted high, drawing her block upward, before spinning and sweeping low with a strike that clipped the side of her ankle. It wasn't enough to drop her, but it forced her to stagger. He pressed the advantage, driving her back with a series of rapid strikes that came dangerously close to landing solid hits. The crowd roared, sensing momentum shift. But Kira wasn't panicking. She recognized the rhythm in his attacks, the deliberate alternation between high and low, the half-beats that invited her to overcommit. He was fast, but not unpredictable, and that gave her an opening. As he came in for another high strike, she blocked, letting the impact slide her staff slightly off balance, just enough to make him think he had control. Then as he stepped in to close the distance, she pivoted hard to her left, hooking the end of her staff behind his knee, and pulling. His weight shifted unexpectedly, and in that brief moment, she stepped inside his guard, and drove the padded tip of her staff upward toward his midsection. It wasn't a decisive blow, but it was enough to stop his advance. The colonel stepped back, his stance wide, reassessing. The crowd's noise dipped into a murmur again. She'd stopped him cold, and more importantly, she'd done it without brute force. She'd used his movement against him. The colonel straightened, a flicker of something almost like approval crossing his face. "Not bad," he said, though the steel in his tone remained. "But we're not done." Kira rolled her shoulders, resetting her stance. She could feel the pull in her muscles, the slow burn that told her she'd need to pace herself. This wasn't going to be a short fight. It wasn't meant to be. The colonel wasn't just testing her strength or skill. He was measuring her ability to endure, to adapt, to stay sharp when fatigue and pressure closed in. As they began to circle again, the sun dipped slightly, casting longer shadows across the yard. The crowd leaned forward, sensing that the real test, the one that would decide everything, was about to begin. The colonel's steps were slower now, not from fatigue but from calculation. His eyes never left Kira, and she could feel the weight of his assessment in every measured movement. Around them, the soldiers stood still, caught between anticipation and disbelief. They had expected this match to be a quick display of dominance. Instead, they were watching something entirely different take shape. Kira adjusted her grip on the staff, rolling it once in her palms to keep her muscles loose. The earlier rounds had been about survival, but now she felt the rhythm of the fight in her bones. She could sense the slight delay between the colonel's feints and his follow-through, the fraction of a second when his weight shifted before a strike. To most, it would be invisible. To her, it was the seam in the armor. He came in with a sharp overhead strike, the padded tip aimed for her shoulder. Kira met it with a block that absorbed the impact and slid his staff off to the side. Instead of retreating as she had before, she stepped in, closing the gap and forcing him to adjust. She drove her own staff toward his hip, not with brute force but with precise control, making him twist to avoid it. It was subtle, but she had made him move on her terms. The crowd noticed. A ripple of voices rose from the edges of the yard, some cheering, some simply murmuring in surprise. Even the colonel's expression shifted slightly, the corner of his jaw tightening. He retaliated with a quick combination, high, low, high again, but Kira flowed with each strike, never meeting them head-on. She let them glance off her blocks, redirecting the energy away from her body. Each time she countered, she advanced half a step, taking back ground inch by inch. She wasn't just holding her own now, she was pressing forward. The colonel's breathing deepened, the slow rise and fall of his chest, betraying the effort it took to keep her from breaking through. Kira could feel her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears, but it wasn't panic, it was focus, razor-sharp and unyielding. The memory of Mara's voice came back to her, steady and sure, make them play your game, not the other way around. When he lunged again, she sidestepped, hooked the end of her staff around his forearm, and used his forward momentum to spin him slightly off balance. It wasn't enough to topple him, but it was enough for him to have to plant his feet harder than he wanted. Another murmur swept the crowd. The shift was happening, and they could all feel it. The colonel reset his stance, squinting at her as if trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't realized was this complex. "You're not just fast," he said, voice low but audible. "You're watching me." Kira didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her eyes stayed locked on his, steady and unblinking. It wasn't defiance in the form of taunts or gloating. It was the quiet, unshakable kind. The kind that said she was here for as long as it took, and no amount of intimidation would push her out. Their staffs met again with a sharp crack, the vibrations running up her arms. This time, she didn't pull back immediately. She pressed into the bind, forcing the colonel to shift his grip. Then, with a quick twist, she freed her staff and swept low at his legs. He jumped back just in time, but it was clear she was dictating the pace now. The crowd's energy shifted, their earlier certainty that the colonel would crush her beginning to fracture. Some of the younger recruits leaned forward with wide eyes, watching every move as if they were seeing the rules rewritten in real time. The colonel broke the exchange with a step back, his breathing heavier now. He rolled his shoulders, his gaze still locked on her. "All right," he said, almost to himself. "Let's see how far you can take this." Kira reset her stance, her body buzzing with adrenaline. She wasn't naive, she knew the hardest part was still ahead. But for the first time since stepping into the yard, she wasn't just proving she could survive. She was showing she could win. The sun was beginning its slow descent, throwing streaks of gold and shadow across the training yard. The air was thick with dust and heat, but neither Kira nor the colonel seemed aware of anything beyond the space between them. Every soldier watching knew something was shifting. This wasn't just a spar anymore, it was a battle for dominance, and the outcome was no longer certain. The colonel's approach had changed. Gone was the easy arrogance of the first exchanges. His movements were tighter now, less about putting on a show, and more about finding a way to break her rhythm. But Kira had found her footing. She was no longer reacting blindly to his power. She was anticipating it, shaping the flow to her advantage. He launched forward in a burst, his staff cutting a sharp horizontal line toward her ribs. Kira dropped her stance, letting the strike pass inches above her back, before she swept her own staff low toward his legs. The colonel twisted to avoid it, but she was already stepping inside his guard. Her shoulder brushed his chest as she pivoted, forcing him to backpedal. The crowd erupted in shouts. It wasn't just that she'd gotten inside his range, it was that she'd done it twice in quick succession, forcing him to yield ground. For a man of his pride and position, that alone was a warning. Kira felt the momentum shift like a current in her favor. Every step she took was measured, deliberate, her breathing controlled, despite the burn in her muscles. She kept her strikes varied, sometimes quick jabs to draw his guard high, sometimes low sweeps to make him adjust his stance. Each exchange wasn't just an attack, it was information. She was reading him, as if the fight were a language only she understood. The colonel's counterattacks grew sharper, but they lacked the unshakable confidence they'd had before. For the first time, Kira saw it, a flicker in his eyes, small but undeniable. Doubt. He masked it quickly, but she'd caught it, and now she knew she had an opening. She pressed harder, not recklessly, but with a precision that made the onlookers lean forward in unison. When he swung for her shoulder, she rolled under the arc, spun behind him, and landed a light but undeniable tap to his back, with the tip of her staff. It wasn't a knockout blow, but the symbolism was impossible to miss. She'd bypassed his defenses entirely. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a rising swell of chatter. Even the senior instructors exchanged looks. This wasn't supposed to happen, and yet here it was. The colonel turned, his jaw tight, his breathing heavy. He studied her in silence, for a long moment before speaking. "You're forcing me to work for this," he said. There was no mockery now, only an edge of respect buried beneath the challenge. "Good. But you know what happens when I start working." Kira didn't flinch, her stance remained firm, her grip steady. "Then I guess I'll just have to work harder," she replied, her voice even, carrying easily over the yard. For the first time, a faint smile tugged at the colonel's mouth, not a friendly one, but the kind given by someone who realizes their opponent is worth the effort. He raised his staff, signaling the next round without waiting for a whistle. They clashed again, the sound of impact echoing like drum beats through the yard. Dust swirled around their boots as they pushed each other across the circle. Every strike was faster, sharper, the tempo climbing towards something inevitable. And though sweat streaked Kira's temples and her arms trembled faintly from the strain, she knew she was in this fight to the very end. The turning point had come and passed. Now it was about finishing what she'd started. The heat of the yard clung to Kira's skin like a second layer, but she barely noticed. Every sense was tuned to the colonel, the way his weight shifted before a strike, the tightening of his grip, the faint telltale sound when his boots scuffed the dirt. The fight had moved past raw power. It was now a battle of endurance and will, and Kira was ready to push deeper than she ever had before. The colonel came in with a heavy diagonal strike, meant to overwhelm her guard. She blocked, but instead of simply absorbing the impact, she let it slide down the length of her staff, redirecting the force into the ground. As he recovered, she stepped forward sharply, her staff snapping up toward his jaw. He caught it in time, but the surprise in his eyes was clear. She'd just turned defense into a near offensive in less than a second. Around them, the soldiers began to shout louder, the sound rising with each exchange. Kira could hear fragments, her name, sharpened takes of breath, the occasional disbelieving laugh. She didn't let it distract her. In her mind the noise faded into the background, replaced by the echo of Mara's old lessons. When you're outmatched, you don't win by being stronger, you win by being sharper. The colonel was pushing harder now, his strikes faster, less concerned with control. It was the kind of aggression meant to break someone's rhythm and force mistakes. But instead of folding, Kira matched his tempo. She kept her movements tight, each block immediately flowing into a counter. The space between them narrowed, their staffs colliding in a staccato rhythm of sharp thwacks that reverberated through the yard. Then came the opening. He swung high again, but this time his stance was wider than usual, his back foot planted a fraction too firmly. Kira saw it in an instant. She dropped low, hooking the end of her staff behind his front ankle, and with a sharp twist, she swept his leg forward while driving her shoulder into his hip. It was a maneuver she'd practiced 1,000 times, but never dared to try against him, until now. The colonel stumbled, his balance broken for the first time. He didn't fall, but the shock on his face was undeniable. She had taken his center of gravity and shifted it like it was nothing. The crowd erupted in cheers and gasps, the energy in the yard hitting a fever pitch. Kira straightened, her chest rising and falling steadily despite the strain. She didn't smirk or celebrate, she simply reset her stance, ready for whatever came next. The colonel's breathing was heavier now, but there was something else in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. She wasn't just a recruit anymore, she was a legitimate threat. "You've got more in you," he said, his voice carrying over the din. "Don't hold back." It was both a challenge and a command, and Kira accepted it without hesitation. She tightened her grip, every muscle in her body coiled for the next exchange. The fight that followed was unlike anything the yard had seen that day. Their staffs blurred, strikes and counters flowing faster than the crowd could follow. Dust billowed around their boots, the sun catching on the arc of each swing. And then, almost without realizing it, Kira felt the shift, not in him, but in herself. Her movements were no longer conscious choices, they were instinct, each reaction perfectly timed. She wasn't thinking about what to do next, she was simply doing it. Every lesson, every fall, every grueling hour in that dim gym had built to this moment. When the colonel lunged for a final overhand strike, she didn't block. She stepped inside it, twisted her staff, and locked it under his arm in a disarming move so fluid it seemed impossible. The staff slipped from his hands, clattering to the dirt. The yard went silent. Kira stepped back, her own staff still in her grip, her breathing even. The colonel stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling. Slowly he bent to retrieve his weapon, his expression unreadable. "Again," he said at last, and there was no mistaking it now. He wasn't testing her anymore. He was fighting her for real. The colonel's voice was calm, but the change in his stance told Kira everything she needed to know. This next round wouldn't be a measured test. This was the real thing, the kind of fight that stripped away formality and left only raw ability. The murmurs from the soldiers around them faded into an uneasy silence. They'd never seen him fight like this with a recruit. He gripped his staff differently now, lower toward one end, giving him greater reach and leverage. His eyes locked on hers, and there was no trace of amusement or even calculated instruction, just the focused stillness of a predator about to strike. Kira steadied her breathing. Every instinct screamed that she needed to move before he did. But she was too late. The colonel surged forward with a speed that didn't match his size, the tip of his staff slicing through the air toward her temple. She barely got her weapon up in time, the impact jarring her shoulders. Before she could recover, he pivoted, the opposite end whipping toward her midsection. She twisted, letting it glance off her side, but the force still rattled her ribs. This was different. Each strike carried the weight of years of experience, chained together with no pause between them. He wasn't giving her space to read him anymore. He was smothering her with pressure. Kira found herself backing up, step by step, her boots kicking up dust, as she fought to keep her balance. The crowd's energy shifted again, voices low and tense. It felt as though everyone could sense the thin line she was walking. One mistake, and the match would end right here. The colonel fainted high, and when she lifted her guard, he swept low, the padded end, catching her shin, hard enough to make her stumble. Pain flared, but she bit it back, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her wince. She reset her stance quickly, but he was already on her again, forcing her to defend 3 rapid strikes in succession. For the first time, sweat stung her eyes. She blinked it away, the burn in her arms spreading like fire. She needed space, even a single step to break his rhythm. Then it came, not because he gave it, but because she took it. When his next strike came high again, she didn't block it in place. She angled her staff so the blow slid past her, then spun hard to her left, the movement pulling her just out of range. It wasn't much, but it was enough for her to inhale fully for the first time in a minute. The colonel followed immediately, but now Kira wasn't only defending, she was baiting him. Each block was angled to push him slightly offline, forcing him to adjust his stance again and again. It wasn't obvious, but over the course of a dozen exchanges, he was spending more energy to keep up the same pressure. Her body screamed at her to slow down, but she refused. She let instinct take over again, keeping her strikes compact, precise. She wasn't looking for a single decisive hit, not yet. She was breaking the rhythm, eroding the perfect machine of his offense, piece by piece. And then, just for a heart, she saw it, the slightest hitch in his next swing, the microsecond of delay, when his front foot didn't plant as firmly as it should have. She stepped in, her staff shot upward, knocking his weapon high, and before he could drop it back into position, she pivoted sharply, and slammed the end of her own staff toward his chest. The padded tip struck squarely, driving him a half step back. The crowd erupted, their cheers sharper this time, not because she'd won, but because she'd stood in the middle of his full-force assault, and found a way to hit back. The colonel's chest rose and fell as he stared at her. Slowly, he reset his stance, the faintest glint in his eyes, part challenge, part acknowledgement. "You're still here," he said. Kira tightened her grip, her voice steady, despite the burn in her lungs. "And I'm not going anywhere." The yard seemed to hold its breath. This was no longer a test for her to pass or fail. It was a fight neither of them intended to walk away from without proving something. The colonel and Kira began to circle, boots grinding into the dirt, staffs held low but ready. The crowd leaned in, caught between awe and disbelief. The tempo of the fight had shifted again, not a wild flurry, but a tense, razor-edged balance, where each knew the other was waiting for a mistake. Kira could feel her pulse in her fingertips, her grip firm despite the heat slicking her palms. Her muscles ached in deep, steady waves, but she pushed the sensation to the background. Pain was information, nothing more. And right now, every piece of information told her that the colonel was recalculating. He came in with a feint toward her right side, then pivoted sharply to bring his staff in from the left. She blocked, her arms absorbing the blow, and immediately countered with a quick jab toward his ribs. He twisted just enough to avoid it, but she saw the brief tightening in his jaw, close enough to make him react. The next exchanges blurred into a rhythm that felt almost mechanical. Strike, block, counter, evade. Dust clung to their legs, swirling around them like a storm they'd created. Each time she pressed forward, he angled away, refusing to give her a clean opening. Each time he attacked, she angled back, denying him the crushing blows he'd landed earlier. The crowd began to quiet. They understood what they were seeing now, a stalemate forged from pure will. Neither fighter was dominating, neither was giving an inch. It was the kind of fight that didn't just test skill, but endurance, focus, and the stubborn refusal to break. Kira's breathing came in slow, controlled pulls. She was tired, of course she was, but she wasn't done. She thought of Mara's lessons, her father's quiet warnings, every time someone had told her she was too small, too fragile. Those voices didn't feel like doubt anymore, they felt like fuel. The colonel's movements stayed disciplined, but the smallest hints of strain began to creep in. His swings didn't quite snap back into guard as quickly as before. His pivots had a fraction less snap. It was nothing the untrained eye would notice, but Kira had been studying him for the entire fight. She was waiting for this. When he lunged for her shoulder, she met his strike, but instead of holding the bind, she stepped into it. Their staffs locked for an instant, the force vibrating through her arms. She pushed upward hard, forcing his weapon high. His arms followed the motion, and in that split second, his midsection was open. Kira pivoted sharply, aiming a strike toward his ribs. He caught it with a twist of his torso, but she felt the impact land harder than before. His block had been just a hair too late. The crowd reacted with a sharp, collective noise, some calling her name, others simply shouting in disbelief. She didn't let it distract her. She pressed forward again, forcing him to retreat 3 steps in quick succession. The colonel's expression was unreadable,
but his breathing was heavier, his stance slightly wider, signs of a man conserving energy while trying not to show it. Then, almost imperceptibly, he changed the pace. He stopped circle and planted his feet, inviting her to attack. Kira recognized the trap immediately. He wanted her to rush in, to commit fully, so he could turn her momentum against her. But she had no intention of giving him what he wanted. Instead, she advanced slowly, keeping her guard tight, each step deliberate. She waited until she was close enough to smell the faint tang of sweat and dust, then snapped her staff toward his shoulder. He blocked, and just as she expected, he tried to counter with a sweeping strike, low at her legs. She jumped, not high, just enough for his staff to pass under her boots, and landed with her weapon already angling down toward his weapon arm. The impact made his grip shift, and for the first time in the fight, his staff dipped. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a fracture in the deadlock. The crowd roared, sensing that something was about to give.
The fracture in the deadlock was small, but Kira felt it like a pulse beneath the fight's surface. The colonel's staff had dipped just enough to prove he wasn't unshakable. She didn't celebrate it, didn't even let the flicker of satisfaction cross her face. Instead, she pressed forward, keeping her movements tight, her eyes locked on him. The colonel adjusted quickly, his grip firming again, but something in his posture had shifted. He was watching her differently now, less like a teacher testing a student, and more like a fighter assessing a rival. The soldiers on the sidelines could feel it too. The tension in the yard thickened until every breath felt heavy. They exchanged a rapid series of strikes, each one met with a counter that sent the sound of thwack and crack echoing off the walls. Sweat darkened the colonel's collar, dust streaked Kira's forearms. Neither had a clean advantage, but the tempo had accelerated, and with speed came risk. That risk paid off, but not for him. He came in with a fast sweep at her ankle, intending to force her back, but the dirt beneath his lead foot shifted, just slightly, just enough. His stance faltered for a fraction of a second. To most, it would have been invisible. To Kira, it was the opening she'd been waiting for. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She slid to her left, letting his sweep miss entirely, then pivoted sharply, her staff angling upward toward his exposed side. The padded tip landed against his ribs with a solid, unmistakable thump. It wasn't enough to injure, but the impact was clean and undeniable. Gasps and shouts exploded from the watching soldiers. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. Others began chanting her name, the sound ragged but growing. The colonel straightened, his face a careful mask. His eyes met hers, and for the briefest instant she saw it, acknowledgement. Not pity. Not indulgence, genuine acknowledgement, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Again he said, his voice lower now, almost a growl. Kira reset her stance, feeling the ache in her legs and arms intensify. She was close to the edge of her reserves, but she couldn't back off now. She had tipped the balance, and she knew he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The next phase would be his attempt to take it all back in one decisive move. The colonel lunged faster than she'd expected, his staff a blur. She blocked high, but the force drove her backward. He pressed the advantage, sweeping low, jabbing high, shifting angles with relentless speed. Every blow rattled her arms and sent her boots skidding in the dirt. Her pulse pounded, but she held her ground. If she could withstand this last storm, the fight would be hers. And somewhere deep inside, past the fatigue, past the pain, past the pressure of every watching eye, Kira began to feel it, the certainty that this was the moment she had trained for her entire life. The colonel's assault was relentless, his staff blurred in the air, coming at Kira from every angle, overhead strikes that threatened to crush her guard, low sweeps that clawed for her legs, sharp jabs meant to drive the breath from her lungs. Each one landed harder than the last, and each one demanded everything she had to meet it. Her arms screamed, her shoulders burned, her breaths came fast and deep, but her mind was sharper than it had been at the start. Every clash of wood against wood fed her with information, the timing of his footwork, the rhythm of his breathing, the faint shift in weight before a heavy strike. Then she saw it. He drove forward with a powerful overhead swing, his stance wider than usual, his front foot too committed. It was the same flaw she'd glimpsed before, but now it was deeper. His momentum was all in. If she tried to block it directly, it would crush through her guard. But if she moved the right way, her decision was instant. As his staff came down, she stepped sharply inside his range, tilting her weapon to deflect the strike past her shoulder. The force carried his arms down further than he intended, leaving his torso and balance exposed. Kira let her staff fall from her hands. Both palms shot to his forearm and shoulder, as she pivoted on her heel, her back turning to him, in one smooth practiced motion, the kind drilled into her in countless dusty evenings at the gym. She dipped her hips, caught his weight, and pulled. The colonel left the ground. It happened fast, but the crowd saw everything, his boots lifting, his body tilting forward, the unmistakable arc of a man being thrown clean over another's shoulder. He hit the dirt with a solid thud. Silence gripped the yard. Every soldier stood frozen, eyes wide, some with mouths half open. Kira stepped back, breathing hard, her hands still tingling from the contact. She didn't gloat, she didn't move to help him up. She simply stood there, steady, waiting. The colonel lay still for a heartbeat, before rolling to his feet in one fluid motion. Dust clung to his uniform, and there was a faint streak of dirt on his cheek, but his eyes were alive with something fierce. For the first time all day, he smiled. Not the mocking smile from the beginning. Not the faint curve of grudging respect. This was different, pure and unguarded. "Well done," he said, loud enough for every soldier to hear. A wave of noise crashed over the yard. Shouts, cheers, the stomp of boots on dirt. The younger recruits were yelling her name. Even some of the senior soldiers were clapping. Kira's chest rose and fell, but her eyes stayed on the colonel. The smile faded from his lips as he leaned closer, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You've got a place here," he said. "Don't waste it." She gave a single nod. "I won't." Around them the cheers continued, but in that moment, it was just the two of them. Two fighters who had met at full strength and left the yard changed. The noise in the yard didn't die down for a long time. Soldiers who had come expecting a quick lesson in humiliation were now talking in bursts, voices overlapping, retelling what they had just seen, as though saying it aloud made it real. Kira stood at the edge of the circle, her hands still tingling faintly, the dust on her uniform, a reminder that the fight had been no dream. She kept her shoulders back, and her gaze level, not because she wanted to show off, but because she knew every eye was still on her. The colonel had moved to the far side of the yard, speaking in low tones with two senior officers. Their expressions were unreadable, but more than once, their eyes flicked back toward her. It was the kind of attention that could change a career, for better or worse. As the crowd began to break apart, the whispers started. "She threw him clean over. Never seen anyone move like that. She's not just fast, she's dangerous." Not all the voices carried admiration. A few were laced with resentment, muttered by those who couldn't stand the idea of a newcomer disrupting the unspoken order. But Kira had long since learned that respect was never unanimous. Several recruits approached her cautiously, the kind who might not have said a word to her before today. One of them, a tall wiry man with a nervous grin, spoke first. That was something else. Didn't think anyone could make him hit the dirt like that. Kira gave a small nod. It was just a fight. He laughed softly. "Yeah, sure, a fight we'll be hearing about for months." She didn't respond. Instead she glanced toward the far side of the yard, where the colonel was now walking back toward her. The crowd seemed to sense it, and instinctively gave them space. He stopped in front of her, studying her for a long moment. There was no mockery in his gaze, no lingering hint of the underestimation that had been there this morning. "Tomorrow," he said simply, "you'll train with me." The words landed heavier than she expected. Training directly under the colonel wasn't offered, it was earned. And it meant every day from here on would be harder than the fight she'd just survived. Kira met his eyes. Understood. The faintest twitch of a smile crossed his face before he turned, his voice carrying over his shoulder. "Don't be late." As he left, the yard seemed to shift around her. Soldiers she'd never spoken to were watching her differently,
now, some with respect, some with curiosity, some with quiet calculation. The hierarchy had changed, and whether they liked it or not, she was now part of it. Kira stood alone for a moment, letting the noise of the yard wash over her. The fight was over, but its echo would follow her through every corridor, every training session, every mission to come. She'd earned her place here, but she knew it was only the first step. Tomorrow the real work would begin. That night, the barracks were unusually still. Most of the unit had gone to the mess hall or gathered in small groups, their conversations spilling out into the cool evening air. Kira sat on the edge of her bunk, the dim yellow light casting long shadows across the floor. Her uniform hung over the chair beside her, dust still clinging to the fabric. She hadn't brushed it off yet, partly out of exhaustion, partly because she wanted to remember exactly how it had felt to stand in the center of the yard with every eye on her. The events replayed in her mind, not as a perfect sequence, but as flashes, the colonel's staff cutting through the air, the weight of his body as she pivoted for the throw, the silence just before the yard erupted. She'd trained for years, endured drills that had pushed her to breaking, but nothing had matched that moment when everything came together. And yet there was no sense of finality. The colonel's words, "Tomorrow you'll train with me," lingered like a challenge she could feel in her bones. She knew it wouldn't be easy. If anything, today had painted a target on her back. Some would want to see her fail, to prove that the throw had been luck, that she didn't truly belong. Others might try to measure themselves against her, looking for their own moment to steal. Kira leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. The ache in her arms and legs was deep, but not unpleasant. It was the ache of having done something that mattered. Still, she didn't let herself drift into the comfort of it. She couldn't. Outside, footsteps echoed down the hall. Voices passed by, a few laughing, a few still discussing the fight. She caught her name more than once. She wondered how long it would be before the story twisted, exaggerated, became something else entirely in the telling. Her gaze drifted to the small duffel at the foot of her bed. Inside were the few personal things she'd brought here: photos, worn gloves, a folded letter she'd never answered. Each one was a reminder of the world she'd come from, and the one she was building now. Kira exhaled slowly. Today had changed her place here, but it had also changed something inside her. She'd proven herself not just to the colonel or the watching soldiers, but to herself, and that was a victory no one could take away. Somewhere in the distance, a whistle signaled lights out. She stood, crossed to the window, and looked out at the darkened yard. The dust from their fight had long since settled, but in her mind, she could still see the exact spot where she'd planted her feet and lifted him over her shoulder. Tomorrow the colonel would push her harder. Tomorrow she would step into training designed to break her. But tonight, in the quiet, she allowed herself one small smile. The storm was coming, and she was ready for it. Dawn broke cold and sharp over the training yard. The air carried the scent of damp earth, the kind that promised the day would be hard before it had even begun. Kira arrived early, the sky still streaked with pale gray. She wasn't alone for long. The colonel was already there, standing near the equipment racks, his back to her as he checked the weapons. He turned as she approached, his expression unreadable. "On time," he said. "Good, that's the only easy part of today." She gave a brief nod. No unnecessary words, not here. What followed was nothing like the controlled sparring of the day before. The colonel pushed her into drills that were pure endurance, sandbag carries, sprints until her lungs burned, weapon forms repeated, until her muscles screamed. Between each set, he corrected her posture, her foot placement, the angle of her strikes, never once letting her slip into autopilot. By mid-morning, her uniform was soaked through with sweat, her hands were raw where the staff had rubbed against her skin. Still she didn't stop. Every order, every correction, every punishing repetition, was met with the same steady focus. The watching soldiers didn't jeer today. If anything, there was a new kind of silence when she passed, a measuring look from some, quiet respect from others. The story of the throw had spread faster than she'd imagined, but in the colonel's yard, yesterday's victory didn't count for much. During a brief pause, he tossed her a canteen. "You've got potential," he said, his voice low but firm. "But potential doesn't win fights, work does. And if you think yesterday was the hardest day you'll have here, you're wrong." She drank, the cool water cutting through the heat in her throat, and met his eyes. "Then I'll work." A faint smile touched his mouth, there and gone again. "We'll see." The drills resumed, harder than before. Her muscles threatened to give out more than once, but she held on, driven by the memory of the colonel's body hitting the dirt, by the knowledge that she had earned his attention, and wasn't about to waste it. By the time the sun was high, her entire body ached, but beneath the exhaustion was something else, something sharper. Resolve. She had stepped into the fire, and she intended to walk through it. The next morning, the yard felt different. The moment Kira stepped out of the barracks, she could sense the shift in the air, not in temperature, but in attitude. Yesterday's whispers had evolved into something more pointed. The story of her throw had made its way through every corner of the compound, and while some carried respect in their voices, others carried something sharper. By the time she reached the training grounds, several soldiers were already waiting. They weren't part of her scheduled drills. She recognized them, men and women from different units, all seasoned, all watching her, like predators, assessing new prey. One stepped forward, a broad-shouldered sergeant with a scar across his cheek. "Heard you put the colonel on his back," he said, his tone casual but his eyes hard. "Let's see if you can do it twice. To someone who's actually trying to hurt you." The challenge wasn't official, it didn't need to be. This was the unspoken ritual. When someone disrupted the order pushed back. Kira set down her duffel. "Fine," she said. "Your rules?" "No rules," he replied. The circle formed quickly. The colonel wasn't here. If he knew, he wasn't stopping it. Maybe he wanted to see how she handled this. The sergeant came at her fast. No warm-up, no test strike. He drove a heavy kick toward her midsection. Kira pivoted sideways, letting it miss, and struck back with a sharp elbow toward his ribs. He caught her wrist, twisting, trying to force her to the ground. She let the twist carry her down, then rolled with it, kicking her legs up, and catching his knee just hard enough to break his grip. She popped back to her feet before he could press the advantage. The fight was messy, nothing like the structured sparring with the colonel. Every move was meant to overwhelm, every strike aimed to hurt. But that also meant it was predictable in its own way. Raw aggression tended to telegraph itself. When he lunged for a headlock, she ducked low, planted her shoulder into his midsection, and drove forward. His footing slipped, and in the same motion, she hooked her arm behind his knee. The next moment, he was on the ground. The circle broke into shouts, some laughing, others shaking their heads. The sergeant stayed down for a beat, before pushing himself up, nodding once in grudging acknowledgement. Kira didn't celebrate. She picked up her duffel, and walked toward the main yard. The colonel was waiting there, arms crossed. "You handled it," he said simply. "Good, now we get back to work." The colonel's version of work today was unlike anything Kira had seen. The yard had been stripped of its usual equipment, replaced with a sprawling course of obstacles, walls to climb, trenches to crawl through, heavy ropes, and sandbags lined up in neat, menacing rows. "This is the gauntlet," the colonel said, standing beside her. "You run it until I tell you to stop." "How many laps?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "You'll know." The whistle blew, and she was moving. The first lap was all speed, scaling walls, sprinting across open ground, dropping into mud-filled trenches. By the second lap, her lungs were burning. By the third, her arms were shaking as she dragged the sandbags from one end of the yard to the other. The colonel didn't shout encouragement. He didn't count down the laps. He simply walked alongside at intervals, watching her without expression. The silence was its own kind of pressure. If she stopped, it would mean she'd chosen to quit without him, ever saying she could. On the 5th lap, her boots felt like they were full of lead. Mud clung to her legs, her palms were raw from the ropes, and every muscle screamed. But the memory of yesterday's fight pushed her forward. She had already made herself a target. Stopping now would confirm every soldier's doubt. By the 7th lap, she wasn't even thinking in full sentences anymore. Just commands to herself: up, over, crawl, run. She didn't know how many laps she'd done when the colonel finally raised a hand. She staggered to a stop, every breath a deep drag. Not bad, he said. Most people collapse after half that. Kira didn't answer. She wasn't sure she could form words, but she met his gaze, and that seemed to be enough. 2 days later, Kira found herself in the simulated combat arena, a walled-off section of the compound, designed to mimic the chaos of urban warfare. Today's drill was supposed to be straightforward, a mock hostage rescue against other soldiers playing the role of hostiles. The colonel gave the briefing quickly, his tone clipped. Speed matters, precision matters more. Go. She moved through the narrow alleys with her squad, training rifle ready, scanning corners, covering angles. The first 2 hostiles went down quickly, paint rounds, marking bright splashes against their vests. Then the 3rd corner turned wrong. The soldier who stepped out wasn't using a paint rifle. The flash of metal, the low mechanical click, it was a live weapon. Kira froze for a split second, the wrongness of it hitting hard. This wasn't part of the drill. Before she could shout, the man opened fire. Bullets kicked up dust where her foot had been a moment before. She dove sideways, rolling behind cover, her heart hammering. The rest of her squad scattered for position, shouting. Somewhere behind her, the colonel's voice cut through the noise. Edevane, move. Training took over. She didn't think, she acted. She slid along the wall, came up behind the armed man, and drove the butt of her rifle into his ribs. He doubled over, and she wrenched the weapon from his hands before kicking it out of reach. 2 instructors rushed in, shouting for a halt. The man was dragged away, still swearing. Kira stood there, breathing hard, the metallic tang of adrenaline sharp on her tongue. The colonel appeared at her side. You kept your head, he said. That's the difference between walking out of here and not. She nodded, but inside, she knew something had just changed. This wasn't training anymore, not really. In the days after the live fire incident, the atmosphere in the yard shifted again. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't unanimous, but something in the soldiers' eyes had changed when they looked at Kira. No one questioned whether she could fight anymore. The throw had been one thing. It could have been luck, timing, or a mistake on the colonel's part. But keeping her head under real bullets, that couldn't be explained away. Still, respect in this place wasn't handed over like a medal. It had to be reinforced, day after day. The colonel didn't ease her workload. If anything, he made it harder. More laps, heavier weights, longer drills in the gauntlet. Some mornings she was so sore she could barely lift her arms, but she showed up on time, every time. She didn't complain, she didn't ask how much longer a drill would go. She just worked. Gradually, the tension in the mess hall eased. Soldiers who had once looked through her now nodded in greeting. Some even joined her at meals, offering small conversation between bites. The tall, wiry man from the first day of Whispers became a regular training partner, pushing her to sparring with an intensity that made them both better. One afternoon, after a brutal endurance run, she was surprised to find the broad-shouldered sergeant, the one who had challenged her in the yard, waiting near the water station. He handed her a bottle without a word. She took it, and when their eyes met, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That was all. But in this place, it was enough. By the end of the week, Kira realized she was no longer being tested in secret. She was being included, asked to join unit exercises, consulted during drills, trusted to take point on certain runs. She had earned her place, not just in the colonel's eyes, but in the unspoken order of the yard itself. It was late evening when the colonel found her. She was still in the yard, working the staff forms alone, the setting sun casting long shadows across the dirt. "You've been here long enough," he said, stepping into the circle. She lowered her weapon, sweat running down her temple. "Long enough for what? For me to know what you can handle." He tossed her a small sealed envelope. The weight of it was strange, light, but significant. She turned it over in her hands, recognizing the red ink stamp on the back. It wasn't training material, it was orders. "Read it in your quarters," he said, "and pack light." "What's the mission?" she asked. He gave the faintest of smiles. "You'll find out on the way, but I can tell you this, it's not a drill. You wanted to be here, now you're going to see what that really means." Her fingers tightened on the envelope. For weeks, everything had been about proving herself, about surviving whatever the colonel and the yard threw at her. Now it would be about something else entirely. She thought back to the first day, the laughter, the underestimation, the moment she'd planted her feet and thrown him to the ground. That had felt like the fight of her life. But deep down, she knew it had just been the opening bell. The colonel turned to leave, then paused. "Kira," he said, without looking back, "make sure you come back." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She just slid the envelope into her pocket and walked toward the barrel. The weight of what lay ahead, pressing down, but never enough to slow her. Whatever waited out there, she was ready to meet it head on. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.